The Rocky Mountains do not forgive mistakes, they collect on them. December, Colorado. The kind of cold that arrives not as weather but as a verdict. The sky above the eastern slope has gone flat white, not the white of clouds, but the white of something decided. Down below, a cabin sits alone on the lower ridge, smoke rising thin and straight from the chimney. One window lit, one woman inside who has been awake since before the storm and does not yet know why. On the slope above, half buried in silence, something moves, 3 inches. Just 3 inches of a hand above the snow, stone-colored still. Then it moves, and half a mile below she sees it. She has a rifle. She has a dead husband and an enemy who wants her land. She has 14 months of surviving alone in country that does not care whether she survives. She drops to her knees and begins to dig. The Rocky Mountains do not forgive mistakes. They collect on them. December. The kind that arrives not as a season but as a verdict. The sky above the eastern slope had gone from gray to the particular flat white that meant the storm was not coming anymore. The storm was here. And Jed Calloway was in exactly the wrong place when it arrived, which was not a new experience for him, but was about to become a significantly more consequential one. He had been on the upper ridgeline since before first light. 17 trap sets across 3 miles of eastern slope, each one positioned not from theory but from the slow accumulation of getting it wrong. You lost enough fur. Ruined enough sets. Came back to find the draglog moved 6 inches and then abandoned. And you started learning the difference between where you thought a fox would go and where it actually went. Jed had been making that distinction his livelihood for 5 winters now. It was the only kind of thinking he still trusted completely. The 14th set held a pine marten. He dispatched it clean, worked the pelt with hands that had done it hundreds of times, and tucked the roll into the canvas pack without pausing. The 16th held a red fox, good coat, and he worked that one the same way. Without ceremony, without anything in particular happening in his face. His hands knew the process and his mind was somewhere else, which was not unusual. His mind had been somewhere else for 5 years. The wind changed on his way to the 17th set, not a gust, a change. Complete and final, the way a room changes when someone walks in with news that restructures everything you thought you knew about the next hour. The temperature dropped what felt like 10 degrees in under a minute. The sky to the west went from overcast to the specific flat white that told him what he needed to know. He recalculated without deciding to recalculate, the way his body handled most things now. The 17th set was another quarter mile up the slope, a bad angle on a ridge he did not love in good conditions. The cache shelter was 18 minutes south. His cabin was 40 minutes down the mountain in clear weather. He went for the cabin. The first quarter mile was manageable. Knee-deep in the drifts at the worst points. But he knew this route the way his feet knew it, which was not the same as the way his eyes knew it. He had walked this approach enough times in bad light that the ground itself was a kind of map his boots read without consulting him. The wind picked up steadily, went from uncomfortable to punishing in about 6 minutes. Then the visibility dropped and he moved by muscle memory, counting his steps, holding his bearing by the angle of the slope beneath his feet. He was on the traverse above the drainage when the slab let go. He felt it before he heard it. A shudder through the snowpack beneath him, the way the ground sometimes carries news before sound does. Then the sound, not the roar that stories describe but something lower, more continuous, like a very large thing deciding to lie down after standing too long. He had time to register that he was standing on loaded slope above the natural breakpoint, which was the worst possible position, which he had known in the abstract and had not fully appreciated until this moment. Then the snow moved, and he moved with it. And there was no longer any meaningful difference between up and down. He hit something. A buried log, a rock outcropping, he would never know. Hard enough to strobe the lights in his vision white. Then he was still. Then the snow settled over him from the chest down with the pressure of something that had made a decision and was not going to be argued with. His left arm was pinned completely. His right hand had come up in the tumble and now protruded above the surface. Maybe 3 inches of wrist and fingers exposed to air that his body could no longer feel properly. He could breathe, barely. The snow around his face had settled with a small gap that would close as it compacted further. He had perhaps 2 hours before the cold finished what the slide had started, probably less. He did not shout. There was no one within range of his voice, and the effort would burn through his warmth faster and compress the timeline in ways he could not afford. He understood the math. He had understood the math of a great many things over the years, and it had not always been the comfort people assumed it would be. The thing about waiting to die when you had already been waiting to die for 5 years was that it arrived without the drama it might have carried otherwise. Jed Calloway had not been careless on that ridgeline. He had made a calculation, and the calculation had been wrong by a margin he could not have predicted, and now the mountain was collecting on the difference. He did not feel cheated by this. He had gotten 5 years of cold mornings and clean work and a silence so complete it sometimes felt like a physical substance he could press his back against. Grace would have hated it up here. The thought arrived without cruelty, just fact. She had been a valley woman, a town woman, the kind of person who was entirely at home in herself and entirely at home in the noise of places where people gathered and moved through each other's days. She had laughed at him the first winter they were together, when he talked about the mountains, the way a man talks about something he admires deeply. You talk about it like it owes you something, she had said, and he had told her that was exactly right. She had kissed him and called him a fool and poured coffee from the iron stove with her shoulders moving in that particular way she had when she was privately amused by something she was pretending to take seriously. He had never met another person who looked like that. Like they were precisely where they were supposed to be. She had been sick for 3 days while he was on the trap line. He had not known. Nobody had been able to reach him. He had walked in through the door of their cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in October and found her gone already, the neighbors having done what neighbors do in that country when the worst happens and the husband is not there. He had buried her on a Wednesday, he had left on a Thursday. He had sold his horse to a man in Garfield County who seemed to understand that Jed was not in a position to negotiate and was kind enough not to make an issue of it. And he had walked up into the high country with a pack and a trapline map and no particular plan other than to be somewhere that did not expect anything from him. That had been 5 years ago. The cold crept in along the right side of his face now. He could still feel it, which meant he was still alive, which meant the calculation had not quite resolved. His fingers above the snow had gone from burning to nothing. He was thinking about Grace's hands. The weight of the small Bible she carried everywhere, worn soft at the spine from the places her thumb rested when she prayed. He had put it in the grave with her. He did not know now if that had been right. He only knew he could not look at it in the house. He was still thinking about her hands when his right hand moved. Not because he decided to move it. His body had apparently not finished with the arithmetic of survival and had taken the matter into its own hands literally, without consulting him. 3 dead inches of fingers above the frozen surface, extending toward nothing in particular, except them. Half a mile below, on the lower slope where the timber thinned and the ground leveled toward the creek drainage, a woman was moving through the trees with a rifle across her back and her eyes on the terrain above her, and she looked up. Clara Holt had been awake since before the storm, not because she had anticipated it, though in retrospect the barometric pressure had been dropping since noon the previous day, and she knew enough to read the western ridge like a clock face. She had been awake because her brain had simply refused to perform its function. It did that sometimes since Thomas just stopped cooperating, left her lying in the dark listening to the wind pick up and thinking about things she spent her daylight hours deliberately not thinking about. The knock on the door was not what got her up. There had been no knock. What got her up at first light was the discovery, when she pulled on her coat and stepped outside to read the weather, that someone had been in her yard in the night. Footprints man-sized, deeper in the heel than the toe, which meant someone moving fast or with intention. They came from the northern tree line, circled to within about 15 feet of the cabin wall, and then retreated the way they had come, not toward the road but back toward the mountain. Clara stood looking at those prints for a long moment while the wind worked at their edges. She was not afraid. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. Because fear was a useful instrument when it moved you toward necessary action and a useless one when it froze you in place. And she had not survived 14 months alone in the Colorado high country by confusing the two. Someone had been outside her home in the night. That was information. The information required a response. She went back inside, put on the second pair of wool socks and then the heavy ones over those, laced up the boots she had treated with bear fat in October to keep the leather supple through the cold. The long wool coat from the peg by the door, the one she wore over everything when the cold was serious about itself, and the rifle from the bracket above the kitchen hearth. Thomas had bought that Winchester 2 years before he died, tremendously pleased with it, which had been characteristic of him with anything new he acquired, and generally unrelated to how skilled he became at using it. Clara had taken it down from the bracket 6 weeks after the funeral, because she had understood in the specific way that certain realities arrive in the dark, quietly and without preamble. That she was alone on the edge of the wilderness and being unarmed was no longer a choice she could afford to make. She had learned to shoot from a woman named Betty Marsh who lived 4 miles south, a widow who had buried 2 husbands and showed no signs of requiring a third, and who shot better than anyone Clara had ever seen and appeared to find nothing remarkable about that. She followed the boot prints north along the tree line and then upslope into the territory where the mountain proper began, where the pines thinned and the rock showed through the snow in dark, angular shapes. The wind was already building. She knew she had limited time before the storm sealed the mountain again, and she moved quickly, keeping her eyes on the prints, which were already beginning to degrade at their edges in the rising wind. The prints stopped at the edge of a debris field. From a distance it looked like churned terrain, an irregular swath of disturbed snow maybe 60 yards across, ending in a rough mounded line at its lower edge. Closer, she recognized what it was. She had seen it once before, the spring after she arrived in the country, a small slide on the south face that had come down in the night and taken a section of fence line with it. This was the same geography, just larger and more recent. The surface of the debris was still unworked by wind, which meant it had come down after the storm had begun, but not long ago. She almost turned around. The person who had made those boot prints was likely far from here now, well clear of the slide before it came down. She was standing at the edge of an avalanche field with the storm rebuilding around her. And the sensible thing, the survivable thing, was to walk back down the hill and bar her door and let the mountain do what it was going to do regardless of her opinion on the matter. Her eyes moved across the debris field, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, out of a habit she had developed in the months after Thomas died, when she had understood that the cost of inattention was always higher than the cost of the extra minutes spent looking properly. And that was when she saw the hand, 3 inches of it above the snow, wrist and fingers, the skin gone from the color of living skin to the color of old stone, not moving, extended at an angle that had nothing deliberate about it, nothing placed, only the random geometry of a thing that had ended up where it ended up because the person controlling it had lost control entirely. Clara stood completely still for approximately 4 seconds. She had never in her life stood completely still for 4 seconds before acting. She was not that kind of person. But those 4 seconds happened anyway, and inside them she processed what she was seeing, and the weight of what she was seeing, and the distance between her and the cabin, and the state of the sky, which had its opinions and was not keeping them to herself. Then she went forward. The snow at the debris surface was compacted hard, and she sank less than she expected. She crossed the 20 yards to the hand in quick strides, dropped to her knees in the cold without registering the cold, and began to dig. Her bare hands in the snow burned and then numbed. She worked outward from the hand, following the arm, finding the shoulder, getting her fingers under the edge of what turned out to be a heavy canvas and leather coat. The canvas resisted, the snow having set around it like mortar in the time since the slide, and she scooped and pushed and scraped until she could get both hands under the coat and pull them. And the shape of a man's upper body came slowly into view, and slowly was the right word for it because this was not a small man. This was not a man whose size you accommodated politely and moved on from. This was a man who made her recalibrate what she thought she knew about how much a human being could occupy them. She got her shoulder under his armpit and rolled him to his back with the full strength of her legs and core. And even then it was a negotiation rather than a movement. His face came up from the snow. A man's face, younger than she had expected from the size of him, with a dark beard carrying frost crystals and a cut above his left temple that had bled and then frozen, leaving a dark stripe down the side of his face. His mouth was slightly open, his color was wrong in several ways, but his chest moved. Shallow and slow and with a catch in it that she did not like, but it moved. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at him. She looked at the distance between here and the cabin. She looked at the sky, which was making its intentions clear and had been for the last 10 minutes. She looked at the man in the snow, who was very large and very unconscious and was not going to walk himself anywhere. She reached inside her coat and found the strap from the rifle sling, which she had removed when she slung the rifle across her back. She worked it under his arms, across his chest, created a loop she could get her own body through. She tested the weight of him by trying to shift him sideways. He moved perhaps 3 inches before the resistance of the packed snow and his own mass stopped her. Right then, not to him, to herself, to the mountain maybe, or to the situation, which was simply what it was and was not going to become something else, because she found it inconvenient. She got the loop of the strap over her own shoulder, positioned her back to him, planted both feet as solidly as she could in the compacted debris, and leaned forward with everything she had. He moved. Slowly, in the particular way of something that has been sitting still for long enough that it has formed opinions about remaining that way. But he moved. She moved him. She kept moving him. She did not allow herself to calculate the full distance, because the full distance was the kind of information that would be useful later and was not useful now. She took it in sections. To that rock outcropping, now to the edge of the debris field, now to where the ground leveled out, now to the first of the pines. She stopped every few minutes, not to rest, because resting was not a category of activity available to her right now, but to adjust, to get her breath back, to verify that he was still breathing. To retake her grip on the strap, which had cut through her outer gloves and was working on the skin below at the heel of her right palm. She noted the warmth of blood there and noted it going cold in the air, and noted all of this in the same remote register. She noted everything in when the only important thing was the next section. He made sounds once, about a third of the way down. A groan that rose in pitch and then flattened into something closer to a moan, and both his arms moved without direction or purpose. And this nearly took her off her feet because the shift in his weight was sudden, and she had been braced for stillness. She planted herself and held, and he settled again. She talked to him after that. Not because she thought he could hear her in any meaningful sense, but because the silence was enormous and she needed something to push against. Some resistance other than his dead weight and the slope and the storm pressing in from the west. She said, "I need you to not do that again," she said. "If you have strong opinions about where you end up, you should have considered that before you let a mountain fall on you." After a long stretch broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the wind, "I don't know who you are, and I'm going to be very annoyed if you die before I find out." His chest kept moving. The last 100 yards to the cabin was the worst of it because the slope dropped slightly, and she had to brace against his weight, wanting to slide sideways while the storm had fully returned by then. Wind driving snow horizontally, visibility down to 30 feet or less. She went by feel and by the knowledge her feet had accumulated about this particular ground over 14 months of walking it in all conditions. And her body knew the approach to that door the way. Bodies know the things they have done so many times that the thinking parts are no longer consulted. She got the door open. This required dropping his weight entirely. Which meant a controlled letdown that still resulted in his shoulders hitting the snow with a sound she did not enjoy hearing. And then getting the ice out of the latch mechanism with fingers that were not reliably reporting sensation anymore. And then she got back in the harness and got him across the threshold, and the door frame caught his shoulder, and she stopped and checked his neck before she did anything else. Because a man his size going through a door that was not designed for a man his size was not without its risks. She pulled him to the center of the room and then stood up straight for the first time in what her body was now informing her had been somewhere between 35 and 45 minutes. Every muscle from her shoulders to her calves announced itself simultaneously. She took 3 long breaths. She looked at the fire, which had burned down but not out. She looked at the man on her floor. Then she went to work. The heavy outer coat came off first, canvas and leather soaked through at the seams and carrying what felt like several pounds of ice along the lower edge. Beneath it, a wool shirt, a second thinner shirt underneath that. Below the waist, heavy trousers, a wool underlayer, tall boots with wooden reinforced soles. She got the boots off and examined both feet carefully and found no blackening, no hard whitening, no mottled discoloration that would indicate the cold had gotten into the tissue at that level. That was the most important finding of the initial assessment, and she let herself register it as marginally good news before moving on. His hands were the different concern. Both were cold in a way that went beyond surface temperature. She tucked them against her own ribs under her coat and held them there, both of them, which was an awkward arrangement given their size. Each of his hands filling the space under her arm in a way that made her aware again of the sheer scale of the man she had dragged off a mountain. While she held his hands, she looked at the cut on his temple. Deep. The edges would need to be brought together or it would not close properly. She had thread and a needle in the small tin beside the bottle of vinegar she used for wounds. She did not have anything that would meaningfully dull the pain of the procedure. But he was not conscious enough to experience it, and she told herself this was fortunate and did not examine that reasoning too carefully. She stitched the cut. 7 passes. She pulled the edges together with the mechanical focus of someone who has decided that the task in front of them is the only task that exists. His face was entirely still while she worked, which was easier than the alternative would have been. She cleaned the wound with the vinegar, which she applied without flinching, because flinching was not a useful response to necessary things. She wrapped his head loosely with a strip torn from the older of her 2 spare undershirts and positioned him on his side near the hearth, which she had already built back up when she came in. The firewood was getting low, she noted this. There were things to be done in the correct order. She went through his coat pockets while it dried by the fire. A folding knife with a bone handle worn smooth at the joints from long use, 2 lengths of snare wire, a piece of hardtack wrapped in waxed cloth. A small folded square of paper that turned out to be a rough hand-drawn map of a trap line with notations in a cramped but legible hand, abbreviations she recognized as markers for terrain features and set types. 17 positions marked, nothing with a name on it. She turned the coat over and found a larger fixed-blade knife in a leather sheath on the belt, and a hatchet hanging off the back, the head worn to a shine from use that was about function and not appearance. She looked at his wrists. The tattoo was on the inside of his right wrist. Roman numerals. 14. The ink old and slightly spread in the way of ink that had been put in young and had grown with the skin over decades. She knew those numerals. She had seen them on 2 other men in this territory. Both of them veterans of the same reconnaissance unit. Army of the Potomac. And both of them men who had mustered out at the end of the war and gone their separate ways. Appearing occasionally in Thomas's conversation like landmarks, he used to orient himself in a landscape that had changed considerably since he'd last mapped it. Thomas had spoken of one man from that unit more than any other, not with warmth exactly, with something that sat adjacent to warmth and was partly made of the same materials but had a different weight to it. A resentment that had never been fully explained, and that Clara had never pushed on directly, because some things in a marriage are best understood as weather rather than architecture. You don't redesign the house around the storm. You note it and you account for it and you let it pass. He bailed on us right after Appomattox, Thomas had said once, the words arriving sideways in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. Didn't say a word to anyone, just gone. Had a wife, which made it worse, just left her there. Clara stood looking at the unconscious man beside her fire. She looked at the hatchet and the knife and the trapline map with its careful annotations. The work of someone who had spent serious years learning a specific piece of territory. She looked at his hands, which were calloused in the patterns of someone who worked with rope and wood and leather and metal in cold weather daily, without interruption. She looked at the 14s on his wrist. Jed Calloway. That was the name Thomas had used. She had never met the man. She had a description from Thomas that amounted to big, capable, and gone without explanation after Appomattox. Leaving a unit of men who had trusted him and a wife who had apparently had no more warning than anyone else. 2 things could be true simultaneously. She had learned this the hard way, and she was not going to unlearn it now. A man could be in genuine mortal danger on the mountain and also be connected to a situation that warranted caution. She was not going to act on the latter until she had more information. She was also not going to ignore it in favor of the simpler and more comfortable story of a straightforward rescue. She went back to work. She had vinegar and thread and firewood and the hearth and 3 wool blankets from the chest under the bed, which she doubled over him and tucked under his shoulders to hold the warmth against his sides. She filled the tin cup with water from the kettle and set it near enough to the fire to stay warm, for when he was conscious enough to need it. She put dried beef into the small iron pot with water and hung it over the fire because his body was going to need to recover something, and broth was the most manageable form of that recovery in the early stages. Then she sat down in the chair by the hearth with the rifle across her knees. Because the boot prints in the yard had not been made by a mountain man coming down from a trap line in the dark, they had been deliberate circling. And Jed Calloway, or whoever this man was, had come from above, from altitude, from the direction of the upper ridgeline, which was not the direction those boot prints had come from. The 2 things might be connected, they might not be. She did not yet have enough information to know, and she was not going to fill the gap with assumptions because assumptions in isolated country had a cost she could not afford. The man breathed. She watched the fire and she watched the man. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls of the cabin with the steady impersonal force of something that had no particular feeling about her situation but was going to express itself fully regardless. He came back to consciousness in stages over the following hours, the way injured people sometimes did, with periods of apparent waking that were not quite above the surface of unconsciousness. Once he muttered something she could not make out. Once his right hand moved with clear intention, fingers searching, and she watched the hand travel to the place on his belt where the hatchet usually hung and find nothing there and go still. That told her something about the reflexes running underneath the unconscious surface. The third time his eyes opened properly, pupils tracking and present rather than blown wide. He looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Clara did not speak first. She let him take inventory of what was available to him. Ceiling, walls, fire, blankets, the woman in the chair with the rifle across her knees. She waited for his assessment to complete itself. He moved to sit up. His body sent him immediate and extremely detailed information about why this was an ambitious idea, and she watched him receive and process that information. Don't. And she stood from the chair, set the rifle within easy reach against the wall. You have a head wound and you have been in the cold long enough that your legs are not going to cooperate. I've seen the kind of damage that happens when someone tries to stand up before their circulation has properly restored, and it is not an efficient use of the time we have right now. He looked at her with the eyes of a man running down an internal checklist, assessing. Not the social kind of looking that most people did, the kind that gathered impressions and assigned them to categories for the purpose of making conversation, the operational kind, the kind that was gathering specific information for specific purposes he had not yet disclosed. Your knife is on the shelf. She nodded toward the kitchen area. Your hatchet is beside it. You will get them back when you are capable of standing without falling, which you are not currently. Something moved in his expression, not gratitude and not hostility. Something closer to the adjustment a man makes when the facts of a situation require him to revise his operating assumptions. Who are you? His voice was wrecked, barely above a rasp, and it made the question sound less like a demand than a genuine need for orientation. Clara Holt, this is my property. You have been here approximately 6 hours. You were in the snow before that. I don't know how long before that. He absorbed this. His eyes moved around the cabin in a way that was not casual or appreciative, system cataloging them. She recognized the habit because Thomas had had a version of it, that veteran's pattern of reading a room for exits and potential complications. Though in Thomas it had always seemed like something he performed, because he believed he was supposed to, a role he stepped into rather than a reflex that simply operated on its own. In this man it looked like breathing. Involuntary. His eyes just did it. 14. She said it while he was mid-assessment because she wanted his response without the social layering that preparation allowed. Army of the Potomac, 14th Reconnaissance. My husband served in the same unit. The assessment stopped. Served, he had caught the past tense immediately. 14 months ago, she watched him. Thomas Holt. Not a question, weighing it. Did you know him? I knew of him. He was looking at the ceiling again. Same unit for about 8 months toward the end of the war. I shipped out before formal discharge. Thomas had said bailed. This man said shipped out. She noted the difference and kept it. He's dead. She said it without ceremony, the same way she had learned to say everything about Thomas, because ceremony around it had a way of making it softer than it was, and softer than it was tended to be inaccurate. He was working a timber contract on the North Slope. There was an incident with a failing support structure. The company called it an accident. She let that last word sit in the air between them the way it always sat in her chest. Weighted wrong, like a load that had been distributed deliberately to obscure what was underneath it. The man who was almost certainly Jed Calloway looked at her from the floor of her cabin, his face carrying its damage and its cold and something older than either, and he did not say he was sorry, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated the alternative, because sorry required a response and she did not have one ready. Warren Gids, he said. The name came out the way a man identifies a type of dangerous terrain. Clara went very still. Ridge Creek Timber Company. He was watching her now, the old assessment fully operational again. I know the name because I sold pelts through a man in Ridge Creek who mentioned the company once. Mentioned specifically that Gids had a habit of acquiring land that became considerably more valuable shortly after he acquired it. I stopped selling through that man. He wants my property. She said it flatly. I expect he does. He sent 4 written offers this year. He claims Thomas died owing money to the company. That's a fabrication. Jed Calloway looked at the ceiling and then at his hands, which were still not entirely his own, the deep cold still working its way out of the tissue. Then at her with the look of someone who has completed an assessment and arrived at a conclusion they are not certain they wanted to arrive at. Someone was outside your cabin last night. He said it without inflection, not asking how she knew, not explaining how he knew, just stating it. She did not ask how he was aware of that, because the answer was reasonably clear. He had been on the mountain. He had passed by at altitude. He had seen her window lit at an unusual hour and drawn the obvious inference. I saw the prints this morning before the weather changed, she said. Late after 2 in the morning. I would guess. Based on the temperature then. Were they mine? No. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes without the small adjustments of someone managing a conversation, without the redirects and hesitations of someone not telling the full truth. She was not certain this settled the question. She was also not certain it did not. You need to sleep, she said. You need water before that, and then you need to sleep. What you need right now and what you think you need are 2 different categories, and I am telling you which one takes priority. She poured water into the tin cup and crossed to him and held it out. He took it from her, looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who has not had anything that's simple offered to him in some time, and drank, slowly, as she had said, which told her his body knew something even if his judgment was still catching up. She went back to the chair and picked up the rifle. He watched her do this. You're not sleeping. Someone walked around my house in the dark last night, and I found a stranger buried in the snow on the mountain this morning. She settled the rifle across her knees. No, I am not sleeping. Something moved through his expression then, passing quickly, and she would have called it respect if she had felt confident in assigning him the social vocabulary that word implied. Instead, she filed it under. He had expected less, and the recalibration of that expectation had registered on a face that did not register things easily. Smart, he said. She did not answer. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin walls with steady, impersonal force. Patient and enormous, the way the country up here always reminded you of the proportion of things. How much of it there was, how little of you. Inside, the fire burned down toward coals, and Clara Holt sat with the rifle across her knees and watched Jed Calloway's chest rise and fall in the slow regularity of the deeply unconscious. She thought about Thomas's handwriting in the journal she had not yet opened, sitting in the chest under the bed where it had been for 14 months. She thought about Warren Gidd's expression at the funeral, the particular quality of a man attending an event he had reason to feel complicated about, and choosing to feel nothing instead. She thought about the weight of the man she had dragged down a mountain. She thought about the numerals on his wrist. She did not sleep. The fire needed feeding at 2 in the morning and again at 4. By the time the light changed at the window, that first gray suggestion of dawn pressing under the storm's edge, she had been awake for 22 hours. And her body understood this in every joint and tendon, and she did not care about that at all. There were more important things to know. The man by the fire breathed on, and outside, somewhere in the dark between those boot prints in the snow and whatever came next, Ridge Creek waited, like a problem that had already identified its solution and was simply choosing the right moment to announce it. The second day he ran a fever, not the dangerous kind. Clara had seen the dangerous kind once, a neighbor's husband after a wound turned bad in late summer heat, and what she had witnessed then was a body in active negotiation with something it was losing to. This was different. This was a body doing its accounting, adding up the cold and the impact and the hours in the snow and presenting the total in the only currency available to it. She kept water near him, changed the dressing on the cut twice, and let the fever work through to the other side. She slept in the chair in 2-hour intervals and woke each time with the automatic clarity of someone whose rest had never, in 14 months, been fully permitted to be rest. The third day he was conscious more than not. He did not talk. He watched the cabin with the patience of a man who had nothing to do but learn a place. And by the end of that day she understood he had learned it thoroughly, the location of every tool. The way the morning light moved through the east window, and what it could tell you about the condition of the sky outside without requiring you to open the door, where the drafts entered and which wall produced them. She had lived in this cabin for over a year, and knew it the way you know something you have stopped actively looking at, with gaps you have filled in with assumption without realizing that was what you were doing. He looked at it the way you look at something you might need under pressure, without assumption, without sentiment. The fourth day he asked her one question, not about Gids, not about Thomas. What he asked, looking at the ceiling in the flat attentive way he had when he was doing something other than what it appeared, how long have you been here alone? 14 months. He said nothing after that, but his jaw shifted slightly in the way of a man absorbing a number that changes the shape of something he thought he already understood. She noted the shift and kept moving. The fifth morning he stood, Not steadily, not with any confidence about the enterprise, but vertically, which was its own kind of statement. She watched from across the room as he distributed his weight on both legs and stood there processing what his body was reporting back, the way a man listens to a sound he does not quite trust. He put one hand on the wall, not for support only, but in the measuring way, palm moving along the chinked logs like he was reading something written there. He found the gap in the north window frame without being directed to it. Then he walked to the woodpile, selected the piece he wanted by running his thumb along the grain, and came back to the window and began to work. No announcement, no request for permission. He simply did it, with the economy of a man for whom unnecessary communication had stopped being worth its cost. "You don't have to do that," she said it from across the room, over the sound of water heating. He turned the wood, tested the fit against the gap. "I know, I didn't ask you to fix anything. I'm not doing it because you asked." Back to the window, back to the work. That was apparently the end of it, because neither of them said anything else for 20 minutes, and the cabin was quiet in a way it had not been since he arrived. Not the quiet of absence which she knew in all its variations. The different quiet that settles when two people stop the effort of pretending not to occupy the same space and simply let the fact of it be. She put breakfast on the table without calling him. He came when he smelled it, which told her something specific about the shape of the life he had been living. Men with other people to cook for them waited to be summoned. Men who had been feeding themselves entirely developed the habit of arriving when the food was ready because there was no point in any other approach. He sat across from her and ate without commentary. She watched him. He was looking at his food with the kind of attention that was actually attention directed inward. And after a moment he said, still looking down, 3 nights. Someone circles the cabin between midnight and 2. Stays back from the walls, leaves north through the tree line. He looked up then. "You've heard it. I hear a lot of things on this mountain, not like that." "No." She put her fork down. "Not like that." They looked at each other across the table. The fire put its light in front of his face, and she could see what 5 days of recovery had settled into. The stitched cut healing clean above his temple, the cold damage fading from his nose and cheekbone, his eyes in the firelight the color of river water over dark stone. "You have things to say about Gid," she said. "Then say them." He leaned back. Not relaxed. Never precisely relaxed. But with a deliberateness about the arrangement. Like a man setting up a conversation he had been organizing for some time. Warren Gids had been working this territory for 12 years. Not buying land, pressuring it. Finding the fracture point in each situation, a debt, a dispute, a death at the wrong time, and applying force there. Sustained and patient, until the fracture opened fully. The men below him thought they were in the timber business. The men beside him knew what the business actually was. "I know the pattern," Jed said. "I've watched it from the outside for 5 years without having reason to step into it. I know the shape of it even without knowing your specific situation." Thomas knew something. She had not planned to say it. It came out the way things come out when they have been held long enough that they stop waiting for permission. "He never told me what. But I knew he was carrying it." Jed's hands went still on the table. Not a dramatic stillness. Just the stillness of a man who has stopped doing something else in order to listen more completely. "What makes you say that?" 4 years of marriage. She picked up her fork, set it down again. "I knew the difference between Thomas working through something he was going to tell me, and Thomas working through something he had decided to carry alone. He thought carrying it alone was protection. Some men do." A pause. "Some men are wrong about that." Something crossed his face briefly and was gone before she could name it. He picked up his coffee and drank, and the conversation reached the edge of a room neither of them was ready to enter yet, and they both recognized it and stepped back from it at the same time. She cleared the table. He took the dishes without being asked and washed them in the basin. She came back from the bedroom to find the basin empty and him at the window, looking at the white slope beyond the glass, with his hands loose at his sides, and she understood then that this was simply how it was going to be between them. Two people moving through the same space without negotiating it. Finding the paths the same way Vatar finds them, without consultation, without announcement. She did not know what to do with how natural it felt. She decided not to do anything with it yet. There were more immediate things requiring her attention. The second storm came on the 8th night, and it was larger than the first. The first had been winter conducting routine business. This one had something pointed about it, the way certain silences have direction rather than just volume. The temperature outside dropped until the cabin walls spoke, small contractions and releases in the cold dark, and the wind drove snow against the south face hard enough that she pressed a second blanket along the base of the door. She had been awake for an hour before she heard him shift on his side of the room. Neither of them pretended the other was sleeping. Clara sat at the table with the lamp turned low and the map she had drawn from memory of the Ridge Creek Valley in front of her, marking Gids's operations in charcoal pencil. 3 timber sites, the land office, 4 parcels she knew had transferred to Gids's company in the last 3 years, each one preceded by a misfortune she could now see had not been random. Jed sat across from her with the easy stillness of a man thinking through something that had not yet resolved into language. She marked the site where Thomas had died. Jed's eyes went to the mark when she made it, then back to the table in front of him. She told him what she knew about Cutter, the foreman who had signed the accident report, about the company man from the east who had arrived afterward with papers he wanted her to sign releasing any future claim. She had refused. The company man's face at that refusal had not shown anger, which she had been prey to for them. It had shown the minor irritation of someone who expected a mechanism to function and found it stuck, which told her more about how he had expected the conversation to go than anger would have. Jed told her what he knew from different angles. 5 years of moving through this territory without advertising his presence, selling pelts through different buyers in different towns, sitting in enough livery stables and way stations to understand who held what in the county and how that holding had shifted over time. A man who was not trying to become part of a place heard the place differently than one who was. He had been listening to Ridge Creek the way you listen to a conversation you are not part of. And what he had heard over 5 years had given him a picture of Gids's operation that no single person inside it could have assembled. The lamp burned lower between them. She got up to refill it, and when she turned back, she found him watching her with an expression that was not the operational assessment he usually wore, not the gathering of information for specific purposes. Something else, something that did not have a category in the vocabulary she had built for reading him. "You stayed up all night the first night I was here," he said. "Not an accusation, not even a question. I explained that. You explained part of it." His hands rested flat on the table. "The other part was that you were deciding something." She came back to the table and sat, met his eyes directly. "Yes, whether I was going to be a problem, whether I could trust what was in front of me, which is not the same question but contains it." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile. The muscles arranged themselves in that direction and then stopped before completing anything. A door that opened an inch and held. "And your conclusion?" "I haven't finished reaching it." She looked at him steadily. "You're still here, that's where I am." "Fair enough," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he found it more than fair. That he found it, in fact, exactly the correct amount of caution from a woman in her position, and that he respected it in the way you respect a thing that is accurate, rather than the way you respect a thing that is convenient. She looked at the map. He told her about Judge Nathan Vore, the circuit judge out of Pueblo who covered this district, his reputation for following through on what was brought to him, his schedule, which brought him through Ridge Creek twice a year, his independence from the interests Gids had spent years cultivating at the county level. She asked questions and he answered them without hedging, without the qualifications that men sometimes inserted between a woman and useful information out of a habit, so old they had stopped knowing they were doing it. The directness of it registered somewhere beneath her sternum, in a place that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting. At some point past midnight she said, "I never loved Thomas. Not unburdening, not confession, just a fact that had been waiting for a room large enough to say it in, and the room was this one, at this hour, with the storm outside and the lamp between them. I respected him. I was faithful to him. I wanted him to be safe. But love, the thing people mean when they say it, the thing that makes a life feel inhabited, I didn't have that for him, and I knew it from the beginning, and I married him anyway because he was a good man and I was 28, and the other options were worse." Jed looked at the lamp. He died protecting something. Her voice stayed level. The men who worked for him, what was right? It cost him everything. And I have spent 14 months trying to hold 2 things at once. The grief of what he was and the guilt of what I didn't feel. And I haven't found a way to put them in the same room without one of them damaging the other. A long silence. The storm pressed against the walls. When Jed spoke, his voice was quieter than she had heard it from him. The voice of a man releasing something he had been holding at a particular tension for a long time. "I talked to Grace about everything. She was the person I talked to, the only one, really. When she died, that stopped. I didn't replace it with silence. I replaced it with the mountain, which takes everything you put into it and returns nothing. And from the outside that looks like silence, but it isn't. Silence is empty. What I was doing up there wasn't empty. It was just entirely without return. She understood this with a precision that surprised her. They sat with it, and the night continued around them. And at some point her hand was on the table, and at some point his was beside it. Close enough that the warmth between them was a physical fact before any contact existed. And neither of them moved away from that warmth. Not toward, not away. Just the warmth in the space between two people sitting in the dark talking about the dead they carried, and the specific quality of not being alone with those dead for the first time in a long time. In the morning the storm had passed. Jed went out before full light to check the perimeter. He came back in with his coat still on and his face carrying the resolved look of a man who has confirmed what he expected to find and is now past the stage of wishing he had been wrong about it. He set his hat on the peg, turned to face her. Reeves was here last night. She looked up from the fire. You know who it is. I know how Cal Reeves moves. We were in the same unit for 2 years. He always kept something solid at his back and always took the highest available ground for his sight lines. There's a pine at the north edge of the yard, the big one, with his marks on it. The way the bark is scuffed at shoulder height on the east side. The way he braced. He crossed to the table and sat, and the chair under him made its small sound of adjustment. Reeves went into private work after the war. Tracking, surveillance, the kind of field presence that men like Gids pay well for and don't ask about. If Gids wanted someone to observe and report and be prepared to move on short notice, Reeves is precisely who he'd hire. You're certain it's him? I'm certain about the marks. I'm certain about the positioning. I'm making an inference about who hired him, but it's a short inference. What does Reeves do? Beyond watching, he'll surveil. He'll make his presence felt when that's what's wanted. He'll do what a show of force requires. Jed looked at his hands on the table. But Reeves has a line. He doesn't cross into killing civilians. It's not conscience exactly. It's more like a professional standard he's chosen to hold. Which means if Gids wants something beyond pressure applied, Reeves is not the tool he has arranged for that purpose. The weight of what that implied sat in the room without either of them speaking it directly. Then we can't wait, Clara said. The deadline had been living at the edge of her awareness since Gids's last letter, and she had been managing it by not calculating precisely. She 12 days to the end of the month, maybe 11 depending on how Gids counted. We can't wait, she said again, not for emphasis but because saying it a second time moved it from consideration to decision. No. Jed was quiet for a moment. Then, before we talk about how, I need to tell you something first. She waited. I need you to understand that what I'm about to propose, I started moving on before I told you I was moving on it. And I want to tell you that directly rather than have you find out later. The room was very quiet. Outside, the post-storm air had the particular stillness of high country mornings after weather, the world holding its breath before deciding what kind of day it intended to be. Go on, she said. There's a relay rider who goes south before first light on Tuesdays. Carries messages down to Pueblo and returns by the end of the week. Monday night I got word to him. He looked at her steadily. I wrote to Judge Nathan Vore 3 days ago, before you found the journal, before any of this morning. I told him what I knew of Gids's operation and that I expected evidence to follow within the fortnight. I signed it with my name and my 5 years in this territory and my service record for whatever that counts for. Clara was silent for long enough that the fire shifted once in the hearth. You acted before you asked me. I acted for the situation. Not for you, not in your place, not on your behalf, without your knowledge of what I was doing. I'm telling you now so that you have the complete picture. He did not look away. There's a difference between deciding for a person and deciding for a situation they're in. I believe that difference is real. If you don't, I need to know that. She looked at him across the table. At the hands that had fixed her window and washed her dishes and held her blankets against his body to return warmth to them. At the face that never arranged itself into something other than what it was currently thinking. She sat with it honestly. In another shape of man, what he had done would have been the wall. The same wall Thomas had built, the protection that was also a kind of removal, the decision made in her behalf that assumed she would need less information rather than more. But that was not what this was. Jed had not written to the judge to spare her something. He had written to the judge because Gids was not going to stop, and someone with standing in the territory needed to begin the process, and he had standing and he was there, and he was telling her about it directly and completely, and when they walked into Ridge Creek it would be beside each other. It's not the same thing, she said finally. No, I'm not angry. I know. He said it without relief, which was the right way to say it. As a fact he had assessed accurately, not as a reprieve he was grateful for them. I want you to understand that I considered it and I'm not angry. Those are different statements. Something in his shoulders changed almost imperceptibly. The kind of change that is not visible so much as felt in the quality of the air in the room. I understand that. Good. She stood up. Now tell me about the witnesses. He told her about 3 men he had located through the same networks he had used for 5 years. Men who had worked for Gids and left under circumstances that had left them with things unsaid. Hank Burrell, who had been at the South site the day the unsafe order was given and had told Cutter it was wrong and been ignored. Pete Dolan, who had signed the post-incident report and had been carrying the weight of that signature ever since. And Sam Wicker, who had worked in Gids's land office and had left 18 months ago when they asked him to prepare a document built on a debt that did not exist, and who had kept a copy of that document folded inside his coat every day since, waiting for a moment that would make use of it. 8 months, Clara said. Wicker has had that document for 8 months. He didn't know what to do with it alone. A single man with a single copy of a single document is not evidence. He's a liability. Jed looked at her. None of us knew what to do with what we had alone. That's what Gids has always counted on. She looked at the shelf above the hearth where she had placed Thomas's journal the night she decided to stop treating it as something to be protected rather than used. The cloth cover, the backward lean of Thomas's handwriting visible on the cut edge of the pages. I need to read it, all of it. She took it from the shelf and put it on the table between them. He opened it with the careful hands of a man who understood he was handling something that could not be replaced, and he read them. She watched his eyes move across the pages and the absolute stillness of the rest of him. And she thought about what it meant that this man was sitting in her kitchen, reading the last things her husband had thought it was important enough to write down. She let herself think it fully, let it be what it was. Then she put it where she kept the things that required more time than she currently had. He read for a long time. When he closed the journal, his hands rested on the cover for a moment before he moved them. A pause so brief she might have imagined it. Except she had been watching him carefully enough to know his pauses were never accidental. This is enough, Favor, he said. The journal alone is enough. With the witnesses it becomes something Gids cannot reframe. How do we get the witnesses into Ridge Creek without Gids knowing in advance? I've already sent word to Burl and Dolan. Wicker knows to come. They'll be at the saloon on the main block before mid-morning. He looked at her. We leave day after tomorrow. That's Wednesday. The letter will reach Vor before we arrive in Ridge Creek, which means there will already be a record of what we're bringing before we bring it. Wednesday, she counted back. Monday night he had sent the letter, which meant he had already been planning this before she found the journal, before Reeves appeared at the tree line, before any of the conversations that had felt like building towards something had finished building. He had seen the shape of it before she had and had started moving while she was still reading the terrain. She was going to have to decide how she felt about that. She decided to do it honestly rather than quickly. I need to think, she said. I know, I'm not refusing anything. I need the time. He stood from the table, took the journal from in front of him, and placed it back on the shelf above the hearth where she had put it. The gesture was small and she felt the weight of it anyway. The acknowledgement that the journal was hers, that what was in it was hers, that what they were going to do with it was hers to decide, and he was not going to take that from her, in the process of helping her. She went outside. The post-storm air was cold and absolute, and she stood in it and let it be what it was. The slope below the south fence was white and unmarked. The creek in the drainage was moving fast under its ice. The mountain above everything was exactly what it always was, which was not a comfort and not a threat, and simply the fact of the country she had chosen to live in. She thought about Thomas, who had seen something wrong and said so and died for it. She thought about herself, who had known something was wrong for 14 months and had not found the way to act on it because the way required more than she had alone. She thought about the man in her kitchen who had started moving toward the solution before she had finished understanding the problem, and whether that was a transgression or simply the way of a person who thought in actions rather than in preparations for action. She came to the conclusion she had been working toward. It was not the wall. The wall removed you from your own situation. What Jed had done was different. He had begun work on a problem that was also his problem. A problem he had stepped into voluntarily on the mountain 10 days ago, when he let an unconscious man's hand determine whether or not he was finished with the world. And he had told her what he had done as soon as there was something substantive to tell. She had not been removed, she had been accompanied. Those were not the same. She went back inside. He was at the window again, which was where he went when he was giving her room. "I'm not angry," she said. "I want you to understand I considered it carefully, and I'm not angry. And that those two things together mean something different than either one alone." He turned from the window. "I understand what they mean." "Good." She took her coat from the peg and hung it straight. "Then we have work to do before Wednesday." That night the boot prints came again, closer to the south wall than any previous night. She heard them and did not get up to verify them, because verification was not what they required. What they required was the same response she had already committed to, and getting up to look at the prints would not change that response. She lay in the dark and listened to the particular rhythm of someone moving with deliberate care around the perimeter of a life she had built here, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not peace exactly but was adjacent to it. The specific quality of a situation that had moved from anticipated to arrived, which was heavier than the waiting and also lighter, because at least the waiting was done. In the morning, Jed came in from outside with his jaw set in the way she had come to recognize as the look of a man who had found confirmation of something he had hoped to be wrong about. "He came to the south wall last night." He said it without sitting down, still in his coat, hat still on. "He's not circling anymore, he's measuring." She understood what that meant without him saying it. A man who circles is watching. A man who measures has already decided to act and is calculating what the action requires. "Then tomorrow," she said. "Not Wednesday. Tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the economy of a man who did not spend words on things that did not require them. "I'll send word to the others tonight." "How?" "The same way I've done everything else in this territory for 5 years. He took his hat off and hung it on the peg with a finality that said the conversation about the method was over, and the conversation about the plan could begin, by knowing who to ask. She went to the shelf and took the journal down and held it in both hands, at the worn corners of the cover where Thomas's hands had worn it in the months before he died, the cloth soft in those places from the oils of his skin. She thought about him writing in it by lamplight, the pen pressed hard against the page, the handwriting of a man holding something in. She thought about the fact that he had been holding it in for her sake, or what he believed was her sake, and that this belief had cost him everything, including the chance to tell her himself. She was going to use what he had left. She was going to use it in the way he had not been able to, in the open, in public, in front of people who needed to hear it. That was not the same as undoing anything, but it was the thing that was available to do, and she had learned, in 14 months of surviving in country that had no interest in whether she survived, that the thing available to do was always worth more than the thing you wished had been available instead. She put the journal in her coat pocket where she could reach it. Tomorrow then, whatever tomorrow turned out to be, the 10th morning, before the light arrived fully, Jed went still in the doorway of the cabin. He had been about to step outside, coat already on, hat already seated low against the cold. Instead, he stopped with one hand on the doorframe and looked toward the northern tree line with the quality of attention he gave to things that had already become problems, and were simply waiting to be acknowledged as such. Clara came up behind him. She had learned by now to read the stillness. There were degrees of it in him, different weights, and this one had an edge. At the edge of the tree line, maybe 200 yards out, a figure stood in the open, not concealed, not moving. Just present in the gray pre-dawn in the place where the circling had been happening for 9 nights. And the figure was standing there in the open now because the concealment had served its purpose and the concealment was done. Jed looked at the figure for a long moment. Then he said, not loudly, the words going out into the cold morning with the particular flatness of someone who knows the distance is not as significant as it appears. Go back and tell him it's finished. The figure looked at them for another moment, then turned and walked into the trees and was gone. Not hurrying, not running. Just gone, the way a man goes when he has delivered what he came to deliver and has nothing further to prove about the delivering. He heard that from here? Clara's voice was quiet. He heard it. Will he go? He'll go and then he'll report. Jed pulled the door closed. Which means Gids will know within the day that the man he hired to create pressure and uncertainty has announced the situation has changed. Which means Gids will move before we do unless we move first. He turned and looked at her and she was already reaching for her coat. They walked to Ridge Creek in the early gray of the morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, while the road was still shadow cold and packed hard underfoot. 2 hours through the drainage, following the creek down from the high country into the valley where the town sat in its shallow bowl. Clara had the journal in her coat pocket and the rifle across her back, and the specific quality of forward motion that comes not from having decided to do something but from having finished deciding against not doing it, which was a different and more durable state. Not a step ahead, not a step behind them. She had noticed this about him across 10 days, and she noticed it again now, and filed it in the place where she kept the things about him that she was not yet ready to examine at full attention, because she had other things that required her full attention first. The town came up around them gradually, the way Ridge Creek always presented itself, in accumulation rather than arrival. A fence line, a chimney, the smell of cook fires beginning them. The compressed density of a place where people and commerce and history occupied the same frozen ground. Ridge Creek in December was functional rather than picturesque, the buildings arranged against winter rather than for any other purpose. The main street ran east to west and was packed mud frozen to the consistency of poor iron. Clara had walked into this town perhaps 30 times since moving to the territory. She walked in now with the best reason she had ever had, and felt the difference in the walk itself, the way her feet met the ground differently when the ground was no longer neutral. Jed angled toward the saloon at the far end of the main block, without discussion, and she matched his line, and they came through the door into the low light and the smoke and the smell of wood burning, and the conversation that went quiet in the way. Conversation goes quiet in small establishments when the combination of who has entered and what the entering looks like is worth attending to. 3 men stood from a corner table. Clara did not know any of them by face. Jed crossed to them, and there was the brief exchange of men who have served together and carry that fact in the set of their shoulders regardless of the years between. And then Jed stepped back and said, his voice pitched to carry to the nearest tables without theatrical effort, Clara Holt. She has something that needs to be heard today. The 3 men looked at her. She looked back and did not perform anything for their assessment. The broadest of them, perhaps 50, had hands that belonged to a man who had worked timber for 30 years. The kind of hands where the labor had grown into the skin rather than merely marked it. Hank Burrell. The second was younger, with a scar along his jaw from something that had not healed as clean as it should have. Pete Dolan. The third was close to her own age, and he had the eyes of someone who already knew more of her situation than she had told him, which she understood the moment he spoke. Your husband came to see me 6 weeks before he died. The third man, Sam Wicker, looked at the journal she had taken out of her pocket without deciding to. He said he was going to speak to Gids, and he wanted someone to know what he'd found out beforehand. In case. Clara took this in without the protection of delay. He never told me he'd spoken to anyone. He didn't want you to worry until he knew whether it was going to amount to anything. And there it was, the shape of the wall. She had known the wall was there for 4 years. Had felt its edges in the dark when Thomas came home from the site with something behind his eyes he was not ready to say. She had not known until this moment precisely what had been on the other side of it. The knowing arrived not as revelation but as confirmation, which had its own particular weight, different from surprise, heavier in some ways because it carried no shock to dilute it. Only the clean fact of the thing as it actually was. Your name, she said. Sam Wicker. 3 years in Gids's land office. I left 18 months ago when they asked me to prepare a document I knew was built on a debt that did not exist. He looked at the journal. Is that what I think it is? It's what my husband wanted someone to know. She set it on the table. Wicker reached for it, stopped and looked at her. She nodded. He opened it. Burrell leaned in from one side. Dolan from the other, and the saloon around them had gone to the particular quiet of people who have collectively decided that minding their own business is not the appropriate response to this particular morning. Jed stood at the table's edge with his back to the wall. He was not reading the journal. He was reading the room, not the journal, the room. Every table, the bar, the door, the faces turned toward them, and the faces turned carefully away. Clara understood this without looking at him. Understood that they had arrived at a division of labor without negotiating it. And that this division had settled into place between them as naturally as everything else had. Without announcement. Without agreement. Without any of the language that such arrangements usually required. Burrell put a finger on a page. His voice came out low and even, the voice of a man who has been carrying a sentence for a very long time and is finally setting it down somewhere it can be of use. That order on the 4th of September. I was there when it was given. I told Cutter it was wrong. He told me to keep my numbers. He looked up at Jed. Would I say that to a circuit judge? That's the question. I have been waiting for someone to ask me that exact question. Dolan was quiet for longer. He looked at the page Burrell had indicated, and then at his own hands on the table, which were the hands of a man who had done physical work for decades and had been doing a different kind of work in his head for the past year and a half. I signed the document they put in front of me. After the incident report, he paused. I had people depending on my wages. I told myself that was reason enough. It wasn't. I knew it wasn't, and I signed it anyway, and I have been living with that particular company every day since. He looked at Clara directly. I'll say that to whoever needs to hear it. Wicker reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded document, which he set on the table beside the journal without unfolding it. This is a copy of the land transfer instrument I was asked to prepare 18 months ago. The debt it references does not exist. The signature on the underlying note is not the signature of the person whose name is written beneath it. I have had this copy since the day I left, folded inside this coat, and I have been waiting for the right moment to produce it. He smoothed it flat on the table. I have understood for the last 10 days that the right moment does not assemble itself without assistance. They left the saloon together, the 5 of them, and came out onto the main street of Ridge Creek in the mid-morning light, and the street of Ridge Creek looked at them and began to fill them. This was the mechanism of small towns when it worked in your favor. Information moved faster than horses, and the particular combination of people walking together toward a specific destination with a specific quality of intention was information that communicated itself without words. A woman came out of the dry goods store and stood on her step watching. 2 men who had been working on a roof across the street came down their ladder and stayed at the bottom. The older man who spent most mornings on the bench outside the land recorder's office was still on the bench but no longer looking at the street, with the unfocused attention of a man with nowhere to be. He was watching, fully. Warren Gids came down his own front steps before they reached him. He descended in his good coat and his hat, and he had the specific quality of stillness that had nothing in common with Jed's stillness, because it was composed entirely of surface. Entirely of the performance of a man who had spent 20 years deciding that the performance was the only thing that had ever been required of him. Jed's stillness came from having moved through the need to announce himself. Gids's stillness was announcement, refined until it no longer looked like what it was. He came down those steps, and he found Clara in the gathering, and his expression did what it always did. Nothing. Mrs. Holt. He adjusted her name to her marital status with the practiced ease of reflex. I wasn't aware we had an appointment. Clara stopped at the distance that allowed her to be heard clearly without standing in the shadow of where he stood. We don't. You scheduled this yourself. The first night you sent someone to walk around my house. The street around her shifted. Not a sound. Not a word. Just the collective physical adjustment of the people present registering that what they were watching was not going to be what they had assumed. I'm not certain what you're referring to, Gids said, with precisely the weight of a man who is entirely certain. Cal Reeves. Jed said the name from beside Clara. Beside her, not in front of her. Army reconnaissance. He's been running observation on Mrs. Holt's property for 10 days. You can deny the arrangement, but Reeves keeps his accounts. He always did. Gids looked at Jed for the first time, a real look, the look of a man encountering a variable he was not briefed on and did not have an immediate category for. 2 seconds of it, thorough and silent, then the pleasantness reasserted itself. I don't believe I know you. Free trapper, 5 years in this territory. No debt to your company, no land in dispute, no grievance on my own account. He let that arrange itself in the air. I was buried in a slide on the North Slope 10 days ago. Mrs. Holt pulled me out. While I was in her cabin recovering, you sent a man to circle her house every night. That's how I come to be standing here. The street had gone quiet with the specific quiet of people who have stopped pretending they are not listening. Clara took the journal from her coat pocket. She did not open it. She held it where the people nearest to her could see it was a real object, worn at the corners, Thomas's handwriting visible along the cut edge of the pages. Not a prop, not a demonstration, a record. My husband kept notes. Her voice was the voice she used when the price of something was not going to change regardless of the conversation that preceded it. Level, without performance. He wrote down what he saw at the work site. He wrote down what the foreman told him when he raised concerns. He wrote down what you told him when he came to you directly. She held Gids's eyes without looking away. He was dead 3 weeks after that conversation. Thomas Holt died in a workplace accident, Gids said, and his voice carried exactly the right measure of regret, which was the most genuinely dangerous thing about him. that he had calibrated regret to a precision that made it indistinguishable from the real thing, unless you had been watching him long enough to understand that real things and calibrated things did not feel the same in the room. Certified by your foreman, who recorded what the situation required him to record. Not heat, not accusation, just the sentence and what it contained. Before he did that, my husband went to him and described what was actually wrong and was told to keep his numbers. And before that, my husband came to you, and you told him that men who understood the territory's economic necessities tended to do well, and that men who didn't sometimes faced unexpected difficulties. The pause that followed was not for effect. It was for the sentence to finish its work. A grieving widow with a personal diary is not... I'm not a grieving widow with a diary. Same voice, same level. A woman who had long since moved past the stage of needing her anger to make itself audible. I'm a woman with a written record, 3 witnesses, and a letter already on its way to Judge Nathan Vore in Pueblo. That last part landed differently than the rest. She felt it land, the people around her felt it land, and Gids, for the first time in the conversation, did not respond immediately, which was itself a response, the first unguarded one he had given. Burrell stepped forward. Hank Burrell, 50 years old. 30 of them spent working timber in this territory, with hands that could not be mistaken for anything other than what they were. I was present when the order was given that Holt later documented. I was there when he came to cut her. I was on that site when the structure failed, and I knew exactly why it failed, because I had watched it be made to fail. He looked at Gids without any of the qualifications that fear installs in a man's expression. I refused to sign the post-incident report. I was dismissed. I have had 18 months to think about whether leaving instead of doing this was the right choice. It was not. Pete Dolan, shorter, younger, with the jaw scar and the eyes of a man who had been paying a specific debt for a year and a half, and knew to the hour how long he had been paying it. Same site, same period. I signed the document they put in front of me. I told myself I had reasons. I did have reasons. The reasons were not good enough, and I knew that when I signed, and I have known it every day since. I am saying so now in front of whoever needs to hear it. Sam Wicker held up the document he had carried in his coat for 18 months without unfolding it in front of anyone until this moment. This is a copy of a land transfer instrument I was asked to prepare. The debt it references does not exist. The signature on the underlying note is not the signature of the person whose name appears on it. I prepared this document, I recognized what it was, and I kept a copy before I left. He looked at the document in his own hand, then at the street around him. I have been waiting for the right moment. I have understood recently that the right moment requires people in it. The street had become something different from what it had been 20 minutes earlier. Not a crowd in the sense of an anonymous mass. These were people who knew each other, who had sat across from each other in that saloon and in the church and at the counter of the dry goods store, who had each been separately and privately convinced that whatever had happened to them under Gids's hand was their own isolated misfortune. The understanding happening in real time on a frozen street in December, that their misfortunes were not isolated at all but were the same misfortune in different clothing, was doing something to the air around them that Gids could see happening and could not reverse. A woman's voice from somewhere to Clara's left, not shouting but pitched to Carrie. He told my husband the title was encumbered. It wasn't. We sold for half what it was worth because we believed him. She was not performing outrage. She was simply stating what had happened in the same tone she would have used to describe weather, because she had lived with the fact of it long enough that it no longer required drama, only acknowledgement. A second voice, a third, not anger in the hot sense, not a mob in the irrational sense, just people who had been keeping their separate silences because they had each believed the silence was theirs alone, and who were finding in this moment that it had never been theirs alone, that the silence had been maintained for the benefit of one man and one operation, and that the maintenance was finished. Gids's lawyer appeared in the doorway behind him, young, from somewhere east of here, with a leather bag that had not been designed for this situation. He looked at the street with the expression of a man whose professional judgment was generating information he would have preferred not to have. Gids turned his head very slightly toward the doorway. A small movement. The first tell he had shown in the entire conversation, a man turning toward the one part of his structure that was still arranged as he had arranged it, which revealed that everything else was not. Jed saw it. Clara saw it. She knew Jed saw it because she felt him go incrementally more still beside her, which was the thing he did when a situation resolved from uncertain to decided. The door of the marshal's office opened. Deputy Cass came out and stood on the step and looked at the assembly with the expression of a man who had woken up that morning understanding that this day was going to require him to be a version of himself he had been postponing. He looked at Clara. He looked at the journal and the document and the 3 men standing behind her and the people gathered around all of it. He looked at Gids's lawyer in the doorway, and he made the calculation the situation required. He came down the step and crossed the street and stopped in front of Warren Gids. "Mr. Gids, I need you to come with me while we get this sorted properly. Judge Vore will need to be the one to hear it, and until he does I think you'd be better off answering questions somewhere with 4 walls." Gids looked at the deputy, looked at his lawyer, looked at Clara, and in that moment, not the moment before it and not the moment after it, his face showed the thing that had been behind the performance all along, which was not malevolence in the passionate sense and not cruelty in the hot sense, but the cold practical acknowledgement of a man who had always known that what he had built depended on conditions he did not fully control, and who had simply believed those conditions would hold longer than this. He was wrong. He processed this with the same efficiency he processed everything, and he stepped off his porch. No drama, no final statement, no performance of defiance or regret. Just a man walking toward the building across the street because the calculation was complete, and the calculation said that was the next move. And Warren Gids had never done anything in his life that was not the next calculated move. His lawyer followed. The deputy walked beside them. Clara watched until the door of the marshal's office closed. She stood in the frozen street with the journal in her hand and the people of Ridge Creek around her, and the specific quality of silence that follows when something that has been at pressure for a very long time finally finds its release. She breathed out, one breath long, deliberate, all the way to the bottom of her lungs. Then she stood in it. The way she had promised herself in the dark hours of some night she could no longer precisely identify that she would stand in it if it ever came. She was not going to rush past it toward what came next. She would be in it for 1 full minute and know it completely. Thomas was dead. That had not changed and would not change. The journal in her hand was the record of a man who had seen something wrong and said so and been killed for it. What she had done today with that record did not restore him, did not recover the 14 months she had spent alone in that cabin, surviving the particular grief of mourning someone you had not loved in the way that love, at its most complete, was supposed to feel, which was its own kind of loss that the conventional language of bereavement did not address. She did not feel those things less because this mourning had happened. She felt them alongside it. Both things were true, and the truth of each did not diminish the truth of the other. She stood in it, all of it, for the minute she had promised herself. A woman she did not know well came forward from the gathering. The woman who had spoken about her husband's land, and took Clara's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the holding did not already cover. Then she let go and moved on. And that exchange was small and sufficient, and Clara would remember it clearly for the rest of her life. Burrell was talking to a man she did not recognize. Dolan was being asked questions by someone who had a document of her own, and had not known until this morning that anyone might want to see it. Wicker was writing something in a small notebook with the focused attention of a man who had learned that details matter most immediately after an event when they are still fully present. A movement at the corner of the main block caught her attention. Cal Reeves was walking south, away from the main street, at the pace of a man who has completed what he came to do and is moving toward whatever comes next. He had not come to the gathering, had not stood with them, had watched from the corner and now was leaving them. And as he turned and moved out of the main street's line of sight, he raised his right hand briefly at his side. A gesture so small it was barely a gesture at all. Just the movement of a hand lifted and lowered. The kind one man makes to another when words would require them to be in a different kind of situation than the one they are in. Jed looked at the corner where Reeves had been. He drew the line he said quietly, not the one he should have had. Clara thought about that, about the distance between those two things and what it costs to hold one instead of the other, and who pays the portion of the cost that the man holding it cannot see from his position inside it. She looked at Jed beside her and thought about 5 years on a mountain and the line he had drawn around himself and who had paid the portion of that cost he could not see. "It's enough," she said. And she was not talking about Reeves. He looked at her. He understood she was not talking about Reeves. The afternoon was tipping toward the early mountain dark by the time they left. The town's metabolism was finding its new rhythm after the morning's disturbance. People talking to each other in the way that follows when something has happened together, and the together part is still being understood. The road home was the same road in reverse and was not the same road at all. They walked in the dark, the snow reflecting enough sky to see by, their footprints from the morning still visible and filling slowly with drift. About a mile out of town, Clara said, "You wrote to Vor before I found the journal." Yes, before Reeves appeared at the tree line. Yes, she walked for a moment with this. "You had decided before you told me you'd decided." I had decided that Gids was not going to stop, and that someone needed to do something, and that I was positioned to be that someone. He walked beside her in the dark. "I did not decide for you. I decided for the situation. Those are different things. They are." She considered it honestly. In another shape of man, it would have been the wall. The same wall Thomas had built, the decision made on her behalf without her participation, the protection that was also a removal of her agency. But Jed had not acted to protect her from the situation. He had acted to give the situation the best chance of resolving in the direction of what was true. And he had told her everything as soon as there was something to tell them. And when they had walked into Ridge Creek that morning, it had been beside each other, not with one of them leading. "I'm not angry," she said. "I know. I want you to know that I considered it, and I'm not angry." "Those are different things," he said. "Yes, they are." The cabin came into view below the last ridge, a faint warm point in the darkness, the coals of the morning's fire still holding enough to make the windows glow. They had not spoken about what came next. In all the days in that cabin and all the work and all the late-night conversations, they had not used any of the words that would have named what was accumulating between them. Clara had been precise about this without being deliberate about it. She simply did not say things until she knew what she meant by them. And she had not been certain enough to say them. She was certain now. Not with the certainty of feeling them, which was subject to weather and fatigue and the particular distortions of prolonged solitude, but with the certainty of observation, which in her experience was more reliable. She had watched this man work and think and sit with things he could not fix, and hold himself to a standard he had decided on without advertising that he had decided on it. She had watched him write a letter to a judge on behalf of a woman he had known for 3 days. She'd watched him stand beside her on a frozen street and say what needed to be said in the way it needed to be said, and then step back and let the saying belong to her. She had been paying attention. She had seen what she saw. At the cabin door, she stopped with the key in her hand. Jed stood a step behind her, which was where he always stood when she was opening the door. Not because she had ever asked him to, but because that was how he arranged himself. Always half a step clear of whoever had the task, his size making the consideration more visible than it would have been in a smaller man. She turned around. He looked at her in the dark with those gray eyes that had never once offered her a social performance in the place of actual information. Not reassurance, not the careful staging of connection, just what was actually there. "I need to ask you something directly," she said. "All right, Grace has been gone 5 years. You have been on that mountain 5 years. I need to know whether those 2 facts are the same fact or 2 different facts." He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was genuinely considering it, rather than reaching for an answer that sounded right. The cold settled around them. Somewhere in the high timber, a nightbird made its single note and went silent. "They started as the same fact," he said. "For the first 2 years they were completely the same fact." He looked at the dark shape of the mountain above them against the sky that was beginning to show stars at the edge of the storm's retreat. "I don't know exactly when they became 2 different facts, sometime in the 3rd year. I stopped going up there because I was following her, and started going up there because I didn't know how to come down. Those are not the same thing." "No," Clara said. "They're not. No. Do you know how to come down now?" He looked at her. The answer when it came was not a declaration, not a promise. It was a statement of fact about what had already happened, delivered in the only register she had ever fully trusted from him. "I came down 10 days ago." She held this for a moment. Then she turned back to the door and unlocked it and pushed it open. And the warmth of the cabin's residual heat came out into the cold night, and she stepped inside. She did not tell him to follow. She did not look back to see if he was coming. She went to the hearth and began to work the coals back into something that would take kindling. And behind her she heard the floor take his weight and the door close against the night. And that was sufficient. That was the whole of it. The spring arrived in the high country with the reluctance it always carried for the first several weeks, and then all at once, the cold releasing into 2 weeks of melt and mud and the smell of the earth reconsidering itself under the last of the snow. By the end of March, the slope below the south fence was showing ground dark and rich, and the creek in the drainage was running fast with everything the winter had stored. Clara stood at the cabin door on a morning in late March with the sun coming fully over the eastern ridge for the first time since October. Real sun with real warmth in it, the kind that made the upper slopes throw back a light so bright it was almost sound. She stood with her palm flat against the doorframe, and her eyes on the ridge and the thing she had known with certainty for 3 weeks. She was not afraid of it. She had examined it from every angle she possessed and found nothing in it that frightened her, which was itself information about the distance she had traveled from the woman who had lain awake in the dark 14 months ago, listening to a storm and waiting for a version of herself that was ready for whatever came next. This was what came next. She was ready. Jed came around from the side of the cabin with fence post timber on his shoulder, moved with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had found, in the practical requirements of a working property, a rhythm he had not had for 5 years. He set the timber against the wall and straightened and looked at her in the doorway. Read her the way he read everything, fast and complete and without making a performance of the reading. He crossed the yard. "I need to tell you something," she said. He stopped in front of her and looked, and she looked back at him in the first full warm sun of the year. His face in the morning light, the healed scar at his temple, the gray of his eyes. The quality of attention he gave her was the same quality he gave everything that mattered, which was all of it. "We're going to need more room," she said. He was still for a moment. "Then the south side has room." "I know, that's a summer's work, I know, we have time." He looked at her in the way of a man receiving something he had stopped believing was still available to him. Something he had not allowed himself to want because wanting it had seemed like a claim he no longer had the standing to make. The receiving of it moved through his face in stages, and she watched without looking away, because she had been looking away from things for long enough, and she was finished with it. His hand came up and she leaned into it, and the mountain stood behind them in the morning, unchanged and uninterested and exactly itself. And below it the cabin and the fence line waiting for cedar and the creek running fast with the winter's water and the ground soft and ready and full of everything a long cold season had been holding in reserve.